The first speaker tonight is Marie Warsh, a VGC alumna. She's a landscape historian and director of preservation planning for the Central Park Conservancy. She's worked for the Conservancy since 2005 and has been focused on managing the monuments and conservation program in the park. She has a master's from the Bard Graduate Center with a concentration in garden history and landscape studies, and a BA from Smith College. She's currently working on a book about playgrounds in Central Park. Please join me in welcoming Marie.
As many of you know, Chris Nolan was supposed to be here but was not able to, so I'm sorry to say that. But I'm also really happy to be returning to the BGC to be talking about Central Park. And so I begin talking about Central Park and its layered past with an image of its layered present. And just as a way to kind of introduce what the Conservancy does, which I know many of you in the room already know, Central Park Conservancy manages and restores Central Park on behalf of the City of New York. And I work in the Department of Planning, Design, and Construction, which is responsible for the planning and implementation of all of the restoration projects in the park. And all of these projects involve quite a bit of historic research, a form of digging into this layered past. And as we'll discuss today, sometimes these projects have involved archaeological investigation, a more literal form of digging. And because the theme of this panel is conservation, I also wanted to mention that our department also performs and oversees many object conservation projects in the park. There are over 60 monuments, statues, and fountains that we perform maintenance on and do more elaborate conservation projects on as well. And I bring this up in part to mention that conservation in Central Park, while it is focused on the object, it is also very much focused on the object as part of this larger ecosystem. Monuments conservation is performed in the context of a broader thinking about Central Park and the landscape. And this brings to mind Calvert Vaux, the co-designer of Central Park with Frederick Law Olmsted, would often talk about objects in the park, such as buildings and statues and bridges, as accessory elements, and always wanted them to be subservient to the landscape. And so this is a big part of our perspective and our process, and also kind of zooming out in space, but also zooming out in time, and so thinking a lot about the history of all of these objects and looking at the historic context. And the same applies to archaeology in the park, and that's why I wanted to kind of bring this up. This is an image that shows the discovery of a remnant of a convent that was in the northern part of the park, the Convent of Mount St. Vincent, that was discovered during a survey that we worked on with Richard Hunter in 2014. And this was a survey of potential archaeological resources in the park, a way for us to kind of figure out what we needed to be aware of when we were working on our restoration projects. And it resulted in this archaeological sensitivity map, so that when we are working on projects, we know what we could potentially encounter and what we need to study further. I think it's important to mention also that all of the archaeology projects that we do in the park, or almost all of them, are done in conjunction with restoration projects. We don't really do archaeology for the sake of archaeology. It's often as a result of restoration projects that we're doing. So it's archaeology in the context of our landscape stewardship. We've had an opportunity to work on 3 rather large archaeology projects recently, and I'm going to discuss some of them today, over the course of the past 4 years. And all of them collectively have really broadened our understanding of pre-park history. And I'm going to talk briefly about the first major archaeology project that we did in the park at the Fort Landscape in the northeast corner of the park, which was a pretty elaborate project, and there's not a lot of time to go into all the history and details. But I wanted to share some of the process of working on these projects and our methodology, and some of the issues of preservation and access that have come up as a result. And also talk about how these projects have, again, broadened our sense of pre-park history, and in the process we'll talk about or introduce the Randall Survey Markers project, which Richard will talk about, and also some of the recent work we've done in Seneca Village, which Nan will talk more about. So the Fort Landscape Project, again, like our other archaeology projects, was really started by a restoration project in the area. We were going to be doing some very basic landscape restoration that involved trenching and installing new utilities and path restoration. And so as a result, wanted to really investigate what the potential was for our project to impact these archaeological resources. And I begin with this image of Richard Hunter's on the, I guess, my left, and two staff from the Conservancy standing on this rock kind of looking into the distance, because the way that this project really started was about kind of observing and reading the landscape. So a combination of kind of looking at historic documentation and showing how, and kind of reading the historic documentation in concert with wandering around and studying the rocks and hills. And again, I'm not going to get too much into the history of this, the backstory of this, because there's not really time. But this is an image that shows the fortification system that did exist in the northeast corner of the park. It was constructed in 1814, and it consisted primarily of 3 fortifications: Fort Clinton, Nutter's Battery, and Fort Fish, that were also connected by a gatehouse in the center, which I'll show you another image of. And part of what became interesting about this project was once you started to kind of study the landscape and study this historic documentation, was how much you could really see still in the landscape, and how much the builders of these fortifications utilized this existing topography and geology. And with Richard's help, we started to see how the traces of these fortifications were really written in stone. And so these here were drill holes that were used, that are believed to have been for iron rods that help anchor the earthworks connecting the fortifications. And these believed to be quarry marks that were the marks of the quarrying used to extract stone to build the fortifications. And this line of boulders here probably formed the base of the earthworks that connected them. So these were all still existing in the landscape, and we didn't really know what they were until we started this project and started kind of being able to read the landscape. And again, as part of Richard's recommendations, and in looking at the project that we were working on, there were a few areas where we did excavations to try to determine if, again, our project with trenching and rebuilding paths would impact potential resources that still remain. So this is one of the excavations. And this excavation was created in this area of this gatehouse that, again, connected the fortifications and guarded access to the main road that went through the area, known as the Kingsbridge Road. And what we found was quite amazing. It was the foundation of this gatehouse underground. Think about how many feet down? It was like 2 feet? Or about 2 feet down. And we also found evidence of the road. So this is the surface of the road, which was built on top of a larger stones, larger rubble stones. And just to give a little sense of the significance of this road, this was the main road that traversed the east side of Manhattan in the early 19th century, essentially until the grid plan was implemented. It was also known as the Eastern Post Road because it connected to points north. And so here's where it went through Central Park. So this is the area that we were focused on here. So this is a recent picture of the area. You know, I'm thinking about preservation and access. You know, after the project was completed, we closed up the excavations, and the paths were restored and the landscape was improved, but there was really no evidence of the things that we found underground. And so what we've been trying to think about as part of this project and some of the other projects we've been working on is how do we create access to this history. One of the things that we have tried doing is a program of interpretive signage in the northern part of the park. That there's, I think, 4 signs up there at different spots that share information about this history and really try to get people to read the landscape. Again, I think there's a lot of clues there. This is kind of a rare occasion where a lot of this history can be read in the landscape. And so how do you get people to start seeing it? And we have regular tours up there. We do special tours. And so taking people around, I think, is a really kind of key part of doing this. So, as I mentioned, a lot of these projects have really broadened our sense of what pre-park history is, and I think they really have made us kind of rethink the typical narrative about the creation of the park. And this is an illustration of the Greensward plan, one of the presentation drawings that was done in conjunction with the Greensward plan, the original plan for the park, that shows the existing landscape here and then the effect proposed, so what they proposed that the park would be. And this really is tied up with a lot of the rhetoric in the surrounding the creation of the park, that the existing landscape was very barren and rocky and swampy and very unappealing, and what they were going to be creating was this really beautiful, orderly, and fertile and productive place. And what we've learned through our kind of work on pre-park history and the work of Richard and Nan is really that this is a much more complex story. That there are a lot of pre-park histories, and this is a map of the lands included in Central Park. So this is one of the main documents of what the landscape before the park was built looked like. And even just in studying this, you can start to see that there are many histories, not just this story of a swampy wasteland filled with squatters and poor people that was transformed into this park. One of the kind of complexities of the story is that there are areas of the park that the designers really thought were beautiful and incorporated into the design of the park. And this is another, there are not that very many images or illustrations and very few photographs of what the park looked like before, the land looked like before it was built. This is a rare kind of image of the northern part of the park and this kind of bucolic scene. This is actually the Convent, which I showed the tiny little fragment of in the beginning. But it's these rolling hills, it's these broad vistas, and this was something that was incorporated into the northern part of the park when they designed it, which is in part why there were so many traces of the fort still left, was because they actually incorporated the existing landscape in the design of that part of the park. It's very clear along these same lines that the park's designers were very interested in the geology of the park. This is from a report on the pre-park landscape, and part of the survey that was done, they did all this studying of the geology and what the geology was like, and really also incorporated that. And obviously the rock outcrops in the park are a major part of the experience of the park today. So that's something that I think I feel like people forget about. This is really our kind of experience of the pre-park landscape is really through geology. And again, kind of dispelling the myth of the inhabitants of the park. There were about approximately 1,600 people lived on the land that was created in approximately 300 structures. And the typical narrative is that they were squatters, that they were poor, that they lived in these kind of shanties and poorly constructed buildings on rock outcrops often. And this is an image of the map that shows Seneca Village, which we'll talk more about, that really kind of dispels that myth. It was the most densely populated part of Central Park, the pre-park at that time. This was an area where there were a lot of more elaborate houses. There were 3 churches and a school. It was predominantly African American residents. There were also Irish and German. So just this itself kind of dispels the myth of the typical characterization of pre-park residents, and Nan will talk more about that. This is an image of the work from 2011 that was organized by Nan and other archaeologists and researchers about Seneca Village, and this has really helped us to understand more about Seneca Village and its history, and she'll talk more about that. I also wanted to mention, we've been working on a project in Seneca Village a little bit recently that's also kind of helped us have a better understanding of that history. This is the area that includes part of the former Seneca Village site, and it contains 2 playgrounds. And as part of a larger program of work that the Conservancy is doing to update all the playgrounds in the park, we are doing work on this playground. Maybe some of you have noticed it's kind of happening right now. And so preliminary to that, I'm sorry, it's this playground. Preliminary to that work, we wanted to do some investigations of Seneca, to see, again, like our other projects, if any of the work we were doing was going to be impacting anything that could remain from Seneca Village. So we worked with Richard Hunter and Nan and the other archaeologists who had been studying Seneca Village, and did some excavations near the playgrounds to determine, again, if we were going to be digging up these playgrounds, would we impact anything from Seneca Village. And around Mariner's Playground, the playground that we're working on now, we didn't really find anything. But around Spectre Playground, the playground, the other adjacent playground, we did find evidence of this building here, which was a 2.5-story building that was owned by a man named John Haff, who was born in 1805 and was of German extraction, and a proprietor of an inn at Columbus Avenue and 91st Street. And he lived here with his wife and 5 children, and his son was a noted horticulturalist. So again, as part of all of this work, we're just learning so much more about the people who lived here and how diverse they were. And during this project, again, came up this, how do we create access to this history and to this information? And because we were working alongside playgrounds, we often had these very curious spectators. At one point, there was a group of kids standing on a bench chanting at us, "Why are you digging this hole?" This again leads to the bigger question of how do we create access to this information, which is something that we're, why are we digging this hole? It's kind of the ultimate question. So, just quickly, the reservoir is also a big part of the pre-park history and experience, which I think is something that hasn't been fully studied and explored, and relates to the history of Seneca Village. It was very close to where Seneca Village was located, so this again is another kind of part of this story that I think is not known. And then this is an image that shows the construction of the park in the south end, and then also shows here the grading of the streets according to the grid plan, which is another kind of related archaeological project that we worked on, which Richard will talk more about. This is a bolt that was placed in this rock outcrop as part of the laying out of the grid of streets for the Commissioner's Plan. It's located, it marked the intersection of 65th Street and 6th Avenue. Randall surveyors placed bolts in rocks because that was a way to mark the spot on this rock, but in the earth they installed monuments made out of marble, or they were called monuments. And while this was found, it was thought that the marble monuments hadn't survived the construction of the park. But during the survey that Richard and his team worked on, they did notice this kind of odd rock here, and actually a volunteer for the Conservancy also called attention to it, someone who had been interested in the grid and its history, and we investigated further, and we did find that it marked the location of 103rd Street and 6th Avenue. And Richard and his team did an excavation, and we did confirm that on the top edge it said at one point 103, and then the other edge it said 6th Avenue. And Richard will go into more detail about this, but I just want to kind of conclude with talking about, again, this is another question of access and how do we kind of create access to this information. At first, when this was the only one we had found, our first impetus was to hide it and protect it, because we thought this is the rarest thing possible. You know, we can't just leave this out for people. We also, even though we told our staff who were managing the landscape what it was and to be careful, we didn't want someone to kind of run it over with a lawnmower by accident. So we kind of closed it into this planting bed here. But we've actually since found a number of other ones, including this one that's been hidden in plain view for 200 years, marking the spot of 101st Street and 7th Avenue. So, and this is the sort of paparazzi focused on the object. But then really what it is about, and this is actually one of Chris's theories is that actually the park wouldn't really be possible without the grid. And so thinking about the grid sort of and the park as kind of complementary to one another, I think is something that we've been thinking about a lot, and I think it's interesting. Okay, thank you.